Board members, I think we're ready to begin. Let me get to my agenda here. Okay, we're going to start our study session, and I'm going to turn the time over. We have two parts. I'll turn the time over to Deputy Superintendent Angie Stallings to explain what we're doing. Hopefully you're going to talk about how we want to communicate and etc., so we can move agendas on. So your mic is on.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. Just a reminder for those of you who need a reminder. Angie Stallings, your Deputy Superintendent of Policy. And I'm joined to my right by Jonathan Ball, who is the Director of the Office of the Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office. So for those of you who don't know John well, I used to work with him when I was a former legislative staffer, and he is deeply relied on by the legislature to help organize all of the budgets that, of course, we are all impacted by and interested in. And so we're really lucky to have John here today. We may have another member of the panel join us, former Speaker Nolan Karras, and when he arrives, I can introduce him. And the purpose of this study session was, we understand that many of you may have been engaged in some conversations with stakeholders or hearing different presentations about Our Schools Now and the three bills that are related to the Our Schools Now compromise. And HB 293 is a bill that you all we've discussed in board meetings. That's the bill that froze the property tax and increased revenue to the flexible allocation. There are two other bills we'll be talking about. The purpose of this study session is to make you aware of the facts or the situation, so that when people ask you questions about Our Schools Now or these three bills, you'll be able to answer or participate in those discussions. We're not looking for any action today. We're hoping that Mr. Ball and Mr. Karras can present their portions and the information they have, and then once they finish, that you will be available to answer any questions you have. So, is that fair, Chair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll turn the time over to Jonathan now, will give us an overview of the Our Schools Now compromise.
Hang on, sorry.
Hi, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Pleasure to be with you today. Happy Friday. It's beautiful outside, so I hope you get a chance to go out there. Thanks for the opportunity or the excuse for me to come down off the hill, because I rarely get outside my office, so at least I get to drive down the hill and spend 10 minutes on the road. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, I guess you could call it the Our Schools Now compromise, but that's not what we call it, because for us, this is much bigger than Our Schools Now. And so I'm going to start out just giving you sort of the legislative perspective, at least the legislative fiscal analyst perspective, on this package of bills and potential more bills, and then talk to you about what we've done so far, and then some of the unknowns that we'll have to deal with in the next 18 months or so. So what we have been calling this is TRUE, the tax rebalancing for Utah education. And it's a bigger deal than just funding for education. Now, I think everybody can agree that we could probably spend more money in education in Utah. The difficulty becomes how do you pay for that, and what does that do to the rest of our state's fiscal health? So I'm just going to run quickly through how, I think you guys know most of this, but our Constitution, it contemplates four main sources of revenue, right? There's gas tax that goes into the transportation fund, and it can be used for transportation. Pretty simple. You have income tax that you all know about, goes in the education fund, and you can use that for public ed, and since the late 90s, you can also use it for higher education. We have property tax in the Constitution, and the property tax stays, at least basic levy and, well, actually all the property taxes stay with local governments. But in this case, when I'm talking about voted and board levies and the basic levy, those can be used for public education. And then finally, the Constitution contemplates the sales tax that we can use for everything. That goes into the general fund, right? So this is how everybody thinks of our state financial system, these 4 buckets that are sort of earmarked for certain purposes. But it is not that simple. And it's not that simple because we've built a bunch of these sieves between these buckets. So for instance, the minimum school program we use to equalize local property tax, right? So you've got money moving back and forth between income tax and property tax via the minimum school program. Of course, higher education spending, since the constitutional amendment, we can move education fund and sales tax back and forth in higher education. And then finally, we have a series of earmarks that go into the transportation investment fund from the sales tax, and that helps us move money back and forth between the transportation fund and the general fund. So it's not as stovepiped as you might think or as others might believe. Typically what happens is during an expansionary period, you get money that moves one way, and then during a contractionary period, the money moves the other way. And from a fiscal perspective, this is a good thing for us because it's basically diversifying our revenue sources. It allows us to manage volatility. It allows us to make sure we're maintaining commitments that we've made over time and through the business cycle. So that's our perspective. That's where I'm coming from when I'm thinking about the Our Schools Now proposal or the true proposal. So what's been happening? I'm just going to quickly go through where we were coming from. These lines, they represent the share of these 4 different buckets in the state budget. And you can see that way back in 1996, general and education were about equal shares of the state budget, and transportation and local property tax were also equal. And over time, education fund, the amount of education fund in the state budget has increased dramatically, while the amount of general fund has decreased dramatically. And property and local property and transportation have stayed, relatively the same. Not huge changes there. Why is that happening? I don't have to tell you all this why this is happening. You might say it's online sales, but it's not. The taxable sales as a proportion of our total sales is declining over time. People are changing what they buy. My best example of this is my 18-year-old daughter. When she was 16 years old, I grew up in Michigan. I always wanted a car when I turned 16. I was going to give my child a car when they turned 16. She didn't want a car. She wanted to go to Nepal. So, they probably collect sales tax in Nepal. I don't know. But I'm sure we're not getting it here in Utah, whereas car sales, we would have been collecting sales tax on them, right? So consumption patterns are changing. Online sales is part of it. We're aging. We're consuming more services. As a result, sales tax base is declining, which means general fund is declining. We also have sales tax earmarks increasing over time, right? We're now at $600 million worth of sales tax earmarks going to transportation instead of into, let's say, higher education. And you can see that because of this, we're becoming more and more reliant on the income tax. This is the share of income tax going to higher education. Back in 1997, when the constitutional amendment passed, we talked about this as being like a leveling force where we could move money back and forth, and that would help us through the recessions. But as you can see from this line, the trend is upward. So between 95 and 2003, you can see 2001 through 2003 period, that's right after the dot-com bust, and that actually worked that way the first time. We did use education fund money, income tax money in higher ed to smooth out the recession. But then the next recession, the Great Recession in 2009, we didn't actually go all the way to zero. We kind of kept a floor in higher education, and you can see the trend over time is more and more education fund is staying in higher education, meaning we're becoming more reliant on higher education, on education fund as a state. And this slide shows you that education fund is the most volatile of our revenue sources. These are the rainy day fund caps for the state. Our caps are set based on volatility, so the higher the cap, the more volatile the revenue source. The yellow bar is general fund, the blue bar is education fund. You can see now we're telling our bosses they need to keep 12% of education fund revenue in reserve to cover volatility over an 18-month period. So we're becoming more and more reliant on an increasingly volatile revenue source in our state budget as a whole. This kind of tricks us into, this is where you all come in, this tricks us into a recurring cycle. This is real per pupil spending from 1997 to 2007. So this is inflation adjusted per pupil. Editorial note here, I do not believe that this is the best measure of success in public education because it leads one to believe that we should be trying to maximize unit costs. But it is the measure that we look at a lot. And you can see here back in 2007 and 8, we thought we were making tremendous progress on funding per pupil. And then what happened? The Great Recession happened. And all of those bars came back down in line. And you can see that's not the first time it happened. It also happened back during 2001, during the dot-com recession. And basically, this is the business cycle playing out in public education funding. And if you run a regression through that, you'll see that our spending is flat per pupil in real dollars over this 20-year period. And it's because of the volatility in our revenue sources and the fact that we're relying on growth from the business cycle to pay for growth in education. I think that leads you to believe we need to do something either about the volatility or about the underlying sources or both. So at the same time you have this going on, you have motor fuel taxes that are pretty much stagnant because these are consumption-based and not price-based. So this is motor fuel taxes as a percentage of GDP and income, flat for the past 20 years. And you have property tax that is declining over time as a proportion of public education spending. This is actually not my chart. This chart is from the Utah Foundation. And it shows that compared to the nation, state sources were actually $2 per $1,000 of personal income more than the U.S., but local sources were $3.10 less than the U.S. And this is another good way to look at it. This is basic levy as a percentage of the basic program. And you can see what happens there as the basic program grows, we pay for all of the growth and all of the value increases using income tax, which causes the proportion coming from property tax to decline over time. You can see the blue bars there, that's Aaron Osmond, right? So along comes Aaron Osmond and increases the property tax, the basic levy to pay for equalization. But we still see the decline continue after that one-time fix. Okay, so along comes Our Schools Now. And Our Schools Now says, let's raise personal income tax from 5 to 5.45% and increase sales tax from 4.7 to 5.15%. Given the perspective that I have given you now, you might think to yourself, well, that probably would not be good for long-term fiscal health, because what it does is it makes us more reliant on that volatile revenue source, being income tax, and it increases the rate on an increasingly narrowing base of sales tax, which becomes also volatile. And we can only raise taxes every once in a while and stay in our elected positions. So if you do this now, you probably don't have a chance to do tax reform later. So I think that explains at least some of the resistance to the Our Schools Now proposal from lawmakers. Of course, there are other reasons why they would resist it. That brings us to these two bills and to the compromise. So given all of that background, where my bosses were coming from was, if we're going to break out of that cycle, if we're going to pay for increased investment in public education, we need to do it in such a way that we are addressing the structural problems in our revenue system, and that we're also limiting volatility. So Angie told you about the two bills. There's actually three bills, but the first one is a predicate of the second. The first bill, of course, being the tax rebalancing revisions. That's the one where we change all the tax code and we invest money in education. The second one is the opinion question about raising gas tax 10 cents. I've tried to spell that out, all of the whole thing. Okay, so from my perspective, this is a package. On the revenue side, these bills together, they do these four things. They broaden the income tax base. They do that. Actually, it was federal tax reform that did that for us. So federal tax reform limited personal exemptions or eliminated personal exemptions. We all get a credit for personal exemptions in Utah. If those go away, the credit goes away, which it broadens our base. Because of that, we could lower the rate, and then we allowed certain industries to apportion their corporate income using Utah sales instead of the traditional three-legged factor. On property tax, we set the basic levy floor at 0.0016 for 5 years. We adjusted or allowed the legislature to adjust the basic levy upward for increases in the value of the weighted pupil unit. And then we also increased the circuit breaker for folks that, low-income people that are homeowners. On the gas tax, we put this opinion question on the ballot, or we instructed the lieutenant governor to put this opinion question on the ballot. And then potentially, if that passes, we would raise motor fuel by 10 cents per gallon. That's about $180 million in the first full year of implementation. And then the part that people maybe forget is we also have to change the sales tax to make this work. We have to reduce the sales tax earmarks to get that gas tax revenue back into roads, take the sales tax back, put it in higher ed. So the bills don't do this, but they contemplate decreasing those sales tax earmarks and bringing that money back into higher education. The spending side of this is the next slide. The compromise on the spending side was that before this compromise, the legislature had been contemplating a 4% increase in the value of the weighted pupil unit. Under the compromise, 2.5% of that went directly to the minimum school program. In addition, of course, we paid for formulaic student enrollment growth, and I know there's some disagreement about what that means, but I'm talking about what it says in statute when I say student growth. We also paid about $46 million worth of programs below the line, so that's equal to 1.5% of the WPU. Of course, there was the $36 million for increased property tax equalization, and then of that 4%, 1.5% went into this new teacher and student success account. For the first year, we did that via flexible allocation WPU distribution. And why did we do that? Because it was day 45. That's why we did it. And we didn't know what this the teacher and student success account meant. We didn't have a definition for it. So we have a 1-year hiatus, sort of a transition year where that 1.5% goes to public ed through the flexible allocation. The new revenue from the basic levy indexing, so that was $19 million. That's keeping basic levy equal as a proportion of the minimum school program. That $19 million also went into the teacher and student success account. And then finally, potentially 56% of any increase in motor fuel tax will go into this new account. That's about $100 million. The other parts of the spending are higher education. We'll get about $25 million in the first full year of implementation from the gas tax. That's about 14% of the increase. And then B and C roads by statute. So Class B and Class C roads are local roads. they'll get 30% of that 10-cent gas tax increase, which is about $55 million in fiscal year 20. So I guess this is my last slide, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And Mr. Karras is here as well. He probably wants to present to you. I just wanted to highlight for you that there are a lot of known unknowns, to quote a former vice president. And of course, there are the unknown unknowns, which I haven't listed because they're unknown. So these are the known unknowns. And I think there are two sides to this coin. One is there's some risk associated with these known unknowns, and so you need to be careful in making investment decisions with the revenue that you're getting right now. But there are also an upside to it, beyond the fact that it's more revenue. Because this compromise occurred in the 2018 general session, the revenue from this actually is accruing to school districts 2 years earlier than it would have under our schools now. So you could view this as a bonus almost. So here are the known unknowns. The first one is we don't know how the money in the student and teacher success account will be distributed. That is not defined. Right now, I mentioned it's going to flexible allocation, which just goes out on the formula. But that changes in fiscal year 2020. In the base budget for fiscal year 2020, the money that's now in flexible allocation will go into the student and teacher success account. There were certain limitations on that student and teacher success account in the proposal by our schools now. I don't know if those will be imposed in this account in statute or not, but one of them was to limit the amount of the money in that account that could be used for teacher salaries. The other question we don't know is whether or not the gas tax opinion question will pass. So that's up to the voters. Assuming it does pass, we also don't know whether the legislature will increase gas tax, because that takes a separate step. So the legislature, John Fellows, our general counsel, says that the legislature is constitutionally prohibited from a current legislature is constitutionally prohibited from binding a future legislature. And therefore, we can't put a initiative type question on the ballot. As a legislature, you can only put an opinion question on the ballot. So if the opinion question passes, the next legislature is not bound by that opinion question. They have to make a separate decision about the same question. So will the legislature increase the gas tax if the opinion question passes? It's an unknown. The opinion question does not have a date in it. If you look at the bill that Representative Edwards passed, all it says is, will the legislature increase gas tax by 10 cents per gallon? And it doesn't say when would they do that. So there's some question there. And then finally, I brought to your attention that the gas tax increase alone is not sufficient to get money into higher and therefore public education. You also have to reduce earmarks to make that happen. So the question, will the legislature, once it increases gas taxes, will it reduce earmarks? So given those known unknowns, I think that we're sort of in a transition right now. Certainly the additional revenue from property tax, that was sort of like, I'm going to say 5 years ago, I would have bet 90% chance that would never happen. Freezing the basic levy, I just thought that would never happen. And indexing the basic levy for value increases in the minimum school program, that's like a 15% bonus every year. I never thought that was going to happen. So those are good things, and they happened, and that we should all be very happy about that. But the rest of this revenue, the gas tax revenue, I think you need to be really cautious about what happens with that going forward, and do what we always do here in Utah. And probably the reason that we're constantly ranked as one of the best managed states is we plan for the worst and we hope for the best. If we keep doing that, in this case, I think we'll be in good shape.
Okay, questions? Are we to that? Board Member Lear?
I'll start with thank you for coming and giving the legislative explanation of this. I appreciate that very much, especially on a beautiful Friday afternoon. That's really helpful and thoughtful. I guess what I have is more of a concern and a comment that I've been dying to say to somebody, and so you're just the messenger. So I'm sorry you're stuck with it. But I say this as a lifetime educator and a board member, and somebody who participated in a actively and fervently participated in a former referendum effort. And when I saw our schools now mounting the same effort, I was so hugely excited. It energized the community, I think the education community. It was a symbolic message as much as it was a message about money. And then a compromise was struck, which I understand. I know how hard that original initiative, or it was a referendum in 2007 or 9, I forget, and then the legislature made it harder and harder and harder. And so I know what an insurmountable effort that would have been by our schools now. But I've got to say I was disappointed. And I guess, so what I'm saying to you is I guess my biggest concern is what you've just validated is I think I felt like, well, at least we might get some gas tax money out of it. And then you've just reminded me, it's 50-50 proposition at best. And I guess I want to just express frustration that I would have loved the symbolic effort. And I even though the money would have come later, it may not have been as much, it would have been, I think, a real shot in the arm for the public education community to say very strongly to the legislature, we need more money. You point out a really important statistic that Utah is a very well-managed state, and I would say, and the budget is balanced on the backs of public education, who doesn't get enough money for years and years and years. So I frustrated, and you're only the messenger. So I really appreciate you being willing to at least sit there politely and hear my frustration. But I just, and I hope this all works out well, and I hope the legislature, current or future, here's the message from voters if they support this gas tax, and then that doesn't even say it will go to education, but it would be a really beautiful thing, and I could recover a little of my enthusiasm. But that's my concern about the whole thing, and I've got to say I was kind of disheartened, and a compromise is maybe half a loaf or a third of a loaf is better than nothing, but thank you for the explanation. It does help, and it does help acknowledge in the legislature or the representative acknowledging that this gas tax increase is not a done deal. Thank you.
Okay. Angie, we've got another guest here. You want to introduce?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So we also have former Speaker of the House, Nolan Karras, who's now joined us at the table, and we appreciate him being here with us. He also has a financial background similar to Mr. Ball, and I believe is a CPA and a financial advisor, as well as co-chair of Education First. And so he has also come to help provide another portion of the story, and then at the end of his presentation, I think then there'll be another opportunity for more questions. So, Mr. Karras, if you'd like to go forward.
How's that, Collier? All right. My apologies. We were told to be here at 1:30, and so we walked in surprised that we were ushered to the table immediately. But we got our instructions from Spencer, so,
Spencer who?
Yeah, where is Spencer?
We can say Spencer
We're
who?
honored to be here with you, and I could, Board Member Lear, I could express the same frustration. I've been working on this daily for 2 or 3 years, so I'm with you. Maybe it'd be helpful to know the process that we went through to get to where we are. We first of all it takes a lot of money just to get the signatures, a lot of money. It's a very difficult process, as Count My Vote's finding out right now. It's okay, but it's just the reality. As we got farther and farther into it, learned that maybe our chances of passing it were maybe 50-50. We had the governor against it, not really vocally, but he was against it. Legislative leadership was absolutely against it. And so as we got farther and farther down the road, and we did collect 150,000 signatures, which had a little weight to it for some reason, we started negotiating with some really fine legislators. And I really do believe they're really fine, well-intentioned legislators. And it's the leadership of the House. Now, I know it'll turn over and change, but we think some of these folks will stay. And when they said, well, look, we don't like your proposal, but if we put one on the ballot, would you support that? And then, of course, you heard about the property tax increases and the indexing and so forth, which I don't think is any small feat. It was an incredible move by the legislature, and a pretty brave one, by the way. So as we got going through it and saying, well, what's our chances of winning this? We were told by consultants we'd have to raise $3 to $5 million to convince the public that this was a good thing to do. And with the governor reluctance, with the legislators, we then found that certain associations, I won't name any, were a little reluctant to come out too publicly because they didn't want to offend the legislators. You can decide why they didn't want to offend them, but they didn't want to take it on. By coming to the compromise, we've done a couple of things. One of them is that we're working now with the legislature. You know that they funded a considerable increase this year. And they promised to continue to do that over this foreseeable future. Now, somebody said to me the other day, a press person said, well, how do you trust the legislature? And I said, look, we're going to have to trust them whether we passed our resolution, original one, or not. We're going to have to work with them. At least now we're on the same side of the table. And as you know, the governor now is supporting our proposal, and key members of the legislature. So now we're finding it's easier to go back to some of the associations and other people who you would naturally think we were together with, and they're signing up and helping us. So it's a game of probabilities, but I'm an old political hack, and my guess is that we've got a much, much better chance of passing this. And yes, he's got some known unknowns, but I can tell you that in our conversations with the leadership, we know a lot of the answers to those known unknowns, and believe that they'll carry forward with that decision. So while we would love to have passed what we had, and frankly it was difficult for us to come to that conclusion, it really was difficult because we've spent a lot of time on it. But once we realized where we were, working with the legislature, and I'm not giving up on representative government, and we really need to work. This is a journey, not a destination, and it's not going to get solved in 1 year in one resolution. So we're hoping this is a journey. So I hope that background helps. You know that there's, Jonathan, my count in year 5 is $332 million or something like that of new money that will come into the system, and that's like a 470 or something. Does that sound right, per student? So while I know it's not enough, and I agree with the board member here, it's a start in the right direction, and there's a working group now that's going to be formed to put together some ideas, hopefully prior to the time we all vote, so that we'll know what we're voting on, and we think there's some good will and good faith there. So that's our hope. But it's been an arduous process, and getting the ballot provisions, just getting the signatures cost us a lot of money, but it did give us some leverage. And I think you probably had the numbers explained to you. I've got a handout that you've got now, I think, that shows you, this is a chart that Jonathan gave us last year, and it's a little dated, about the per pupil spending on a real basis, adjusted for inflation. And you can see that while there's been a lot of money put in the last little while, it's still flat. And we need to update it, because I suspect with the new money the last couple of years, it'll be a little better. You'll see the joint press release we put out that has a lot of information in it from the legislature, from the governor's office, and from us. That was part of the compromise. You've seen the schedule, and then on the back you'll see how much each school district gets in total if this funding works, and you'll see what the colleges and universities receive. So, but I'm happy to answer any questions. We appreciate your your assistants. I can tell you that your superintendent, and is she here?
She had to excuse herself.
She's with Spencer. That you're really represented very well by your superintendent on the Hill. I think a lot of what got done this session is a credit to her and her ability to work with people. So well done in who you've selected, and we certainly support her. And look forward to working with her the next little while. But this is a journey, and we're hopeful that we can make this now the gas tax. It's a little hard to explain to people, and there's a little cynicism out there about whether you're going to take the gas tax. It reflects the imbalance that we've had in our structure, and you probably talked about that before I got here. So the legislature, it would have been better if they simply fixed it since they caused it, but we'll take it to the public and have a debate. We've had a lot of discussion about what the theme will be, and we're working on that right now with some very good people. I won't tell you what Spencer recommended we call it because it's not appropriate in a public meeting, but you can imagine. But we'll come up with a campaign. We're working on getting money now, and we'll see in November. But we'd be happy to have the state board be part of our coalition, and to be able to be part of the people who come, whoever you send to the table, to be able to talk about this and try and form the answers to the questions of the known unknown. So we would welcome that opportunity. In all honesty, we're just advocates. Nobody elected me. I guess I'm the chair of the governor's Education Commission, but that means I just open and close the meeting. And we're happy to be advocates because we believe in our hearts that the education attainment of our children is going to make a difference in the future in a huge way. And we just don't think we're getting it done. And I've got a little granddaughter that's got a 36 classroom of fifth graders. And all she has to do is come home and tell Grandpa about the challenges she's facing with some kids that can't even subtract in the fifth grade, and how she's trying to deal with that issue. And boy, it brings it home real quick.
Well, we do have a couple questions. Let's see, Board Member Joel Wright.
I'd love to hear a couple of things from you, because there still seems to be a lot of confusion. We do need more funding at the state level. I'll agree. I think I come from the most conservative state school board district, and we do need more funding. I'm supportive. I like the gas tax. I think roads should be self-funding, frankly. Would solve a lot of our air pollution problems. It's a great idea. I'll be voting for it. It's not hard for me.
Thank you.
And I'll be advocating for it. But one of my concerns is that we seem to not talk much about local funding efforts. Local districts, if they value education more, they could raise their taxes more. They could pay their teachers more. We talk about bonds and stuff, and they do campaigns on that. But I don't understand two things. One, why do we cap the abilities of local school districts to raise property taxes to pay more? I don't understand that. And then second, is there any graph or something so we could see efforts, so that like when local school board candidates are running, they could run and say, look, the state is great, we'd love to have more money from them, but we can take control of our own ship here in Alpine School District, and we could raise taxes and do these things right now. And there seems that seems to all be a mystery and murky, and everybody, funding only comes from the state, instead of when they talk to their local school board candidate, say this year, okay, do you have the guts to raise taxes?
You want me to take that, or you?
I can answer the second part, which is there a graph? And the answer is yes, and we'll share that with you. We have, of course, there are 13 voted in board levies, and they all differ by district, and we have that all mapped out, and Ben Leshman is in the audience. I think he's got a great representation of that, so you could see by district.
Turn your mic back.
I mean, who cares? If Alpine School District wants to raise their property taxes through the roof, that should be their, business.
Well, I think there's a financial implication for the state, especially as it relates to equalization and the guarantee. But beyond that, it's probably ideology and philosophy. I can't really explain why that you would have a cap in the first place, but there are financial consequences to the state.
May I take a stab at that? I agree with you totally, and we actually toyed and tried in our original Our School Now proposal to see if we couldn't force a match, that we'd put up so much and they'd put up so much. It got so complicated in the drafting, and when you do an initiative, you got one shot, and once you get it blessed, it's done. You cannot fix it. And so we just got to the point where it got too complicated. One of the things we had a problem with was the cap. And how do we deal with the cap? And if you put in the initiative too much information, you're going to kind of kill it. And so your philosophy in my mind is great. Weber School District happens to be mine. And my grandkids are in all in Davis. What flexibility do we need to have? Because the local people do need to try and come up with some of this. I had an intern who was a member of the school board when I was a Speaker of the House, and she used to complain to me about how we underfunded schools. And I said, go back and raise your own taxes. Oh, we can't, she said. We're up. Well, we investigated. They could, and they did some. But it is easier to get somebody else to do it. It's easier for the legislature to make our schools now raise the gas tax. And I totally agree with you. It ought to be a user fee, and we ought to be paying for those roads as we go. And the problem has been, in my editorial opinion, is we haven't done it on a consistent basis over the last several years. When I was in the legislature in the Gaslight time, in the Model T Ford time, we raised gas tax 3 times in my 10-year. 10-year period, we raised gas tax. But you could do it at 1 or 2 cents. You didn't have to do it in some huge amounts and trying to fund. We actually funded the highway patrol at that time out of the road money and weaned ourselves off of it. So it was a very different time. But since the Bangor tax increases and all the fervor that came out of those, and I was majority leader when we did those, and I'm guilty, the tax increases have just, the courage to do tax increases have just kind of gone away. I agree with your philosophy. That's why I go back to the representative government saying that's the kind of thing we need to work with our legislators, because it's just too hard to do in an initiative. It needs to be surgical.
Okay. Board Member Reby.
Thank you so much for being here. As a signature gatherer and a teacher, I would hope that one of the known unknowns would be that we would work on our class sizes. I am a teacher and I've had 36 kids in my class. And the difference between having 30 kids in your class or any number under 30 is unbelievable. And to go to 36 or 35 or 34 just is so hard on our elementary school teachers. So I know that is a known unknown, but if we could really work on class sizes, that would be really beneficial to the relationships we develop and the mental health of our children and the mental health of our teachers as well. So if you have any sway on that, please work towards that one, please.
My granddaughter would appreciate your comment. I can tell you, I'm going to be really brutal here. Lowering class size is so expensive that I would guess that you got a better chance of getting teachers' aides than you got in lowering class size. And I agree with you. We ought to lower it, absolutely. What we've done in this state is to provide the wages we do provide to teachers. We simply stacked them deep, and we've got away with it. And we've got away with it because of partly our culture, and I'm not making any, we just have got away with it. But if you live as I do in the shadow of Ogden School District, where 70-something% of the kids are low and reduced lunch, or what do they call it? Free and reduced lunch. We just got some issues we can't solve by stacking them deep. And I agree with you, to be honest with you, that we didn't provide enough money to do much impact. And we're hoping, you know, the SITLET money is used for teachers' aid. My little granddaughter tells me that if she could have somebody else in that classroom with her for even 2 or 3 hours, she could make a huge difference in these kids that are not keeping up. She can't spend the time with the kids that can't keep up. And other kids, of course, are bored. So I agree with you, but I wouldn't promise you that this is going to do much for class size. It'll have to take a lot more money. I'll let you go get the next initiative, and I'm wearing out.
Okay. Next we have Vice Chair Brittany Cummings.
Thank you both for being here today, and I think explaining some of this in a very easy to understand, digestible way. I was just telling Deputy Superintendent Stallings this morning, is like tax is one of those things I wish I could just get a download so that I could understand it. It's just so big and complicated. So I had a question based on what Board Member Wright, he made a comment about why don't local districts just raise taxes? And this is one of those questions where I don't understand completely. And so could you explain to me the difference between like taxing effort, which is a term that's used often, and then the actual revenue that can be pulled out of a district? So if you have a high effort district and how that deals with actual revenue that a district can bring in.
Yeah, so I'm going to use my own district as an example. I'll tell you a story about why I live in the district I live in. I moved to Salt Lake City from Washington, D.C. in 1998, and I married a Utah girl, and she said, I'm going back to Utah, and I said, I think I'm going back to Utah. But we didn't know where we were going to live. We lived with her parents for a while. And during that time, Senator Howard Stevenson was the chair of the Education Preparation Subcommittee, and he wanted to do a tour of districts during the interim. And so Ben Leishman and I set up this tour where we started in Rose Park Elementary School, and then we went to Jordan School District to an elementary school, and then we went to Park City District to McPullen Elementary School. And I noticed, this is not anything new to you, all of you, I noticed that at Rose Park Elementary School, they had 15 foreign languages spoken, one ESL teacher who was also the librarian. And then at Park City, at McPullen Elementary School, they had 2 foreign languages spoken, so English, Spanish, and one kid had just moved, his dad had moved to Park City from Norway to be to practice for the Olympics, so Norwegian was the Spanish, Norwegian, English, so 3 languages spoken. They had 2 ESL teachers, librarian, and reading specialists. And I thought, well, I thought this was supposed to be free and equal. Of course, the difference is property value. And so even if Rose Park, even if Granite District, is that Granite or Salt Lake? Even if Salt Lake District were to increase effort to max, they don't have the same value that you would have in a Park City District. Because not just the value of the properties aren't the same, but think about who owns those properties. So in Park City District, you have a lot of second homeowners. They don't get the property owner credit, so they're paying on 100% of the value of their property instead of 55% of the value of their property. So you have a lower effort in Park City because you have a higher base, but you're getting more revenue than you would be in like a Salt Lake District.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, when you look at that, you say a 0001 is often what people will look at as a .001 property tax. And you can say, what does that bring in Park City versus Salt Lake versus Tintic versus Tooele? And you'll often see Tintic and maybe somebody like Tooele over here. Park City is always the outlier on the other side. But I think the other portion of that story that people forget too, is, I think, well, John mentioned the secondary homes and businesses versus primary home residents. So if you're a community that's full of only primary residential homes like Harriman versus an area that either has secondary homes or a lot of business like Salt Lake, that will also affect the amount of revenue you can come in. But also Park City maybe doesn't have as many students. They may not have as many children per value or per 0001 as Salt Lake City School District, or if we're going to use Jordan has a booming young population. So there's a lot to take in consideration there. It's very complex. And so that's part of why we talk about effort would be the amount, the levies, and if it's .0046 versus maybe in Park City, they're only levying .001, but Park City's able to get a ton of revenue for their students versus another one. One little footnote that I didn't have the opportunity to just slide in there when we were talking about property tax caps. I wanted to note that HB 293 did do something with respect to property tax caps that was very significant, and districts had been asking for a number of years. For the board local levy, there used to be 2 different caps, a 0018 and a 0025. And certain districts had a higher cap than others, and there's a story behind why that was. But the bill, HB 293, now makes that higher cap, the .0025, is the cap for that levy for everyone. So that did raise the cap for a number of districts.
All right. We have a question or comment from Board Member Cannon.
Nolan, thank you for coming to talk to us today, and thank you for being a champion for public education. It's greatly appreciated. I have watched over a number of years and noted how the percentage of the state budget that was being, that was going to support public education had diminished and diminished and diminished and diminished. And I think a lot of that money was diverted into transportation and the roads. And so now we're trying to reverse that situation, and I'm having a little bit of trouble loving the idea of a gas tax instead of the idea of the sales tax and the income tax, which just in my mind seem easier to put them into education than, to take the gas tax and put it that way. But would you comment on maybe the idea of why money went away from public education and went into transportation and roads, and why it leaves us trying to do this to fix it?
Jonathan can give you the actual numbers, but if you remember in '96 we passed, is that the year, Jonathan?
97 for the constitutional amendment.
Constitutional amendment that allowed higher ed to get money out of the public ed bucket, the income tax. And really, the legislature since then has used it as kind of a, it goes up and down, amount they use out of higher ed. The income, it goes to higher ed. The income tax was so robust at the time that they just felt like they had to be able to have the latitude to use it for funding. But as a result of that, and you heard President Niederhauser talk about this, the money went from public ed funding, traditional, to higher ed, and then was able to be diverted to roads, even to the point where they took, I think it was 17% of the general fund money at one time and put it over into roads. I don't disagree. I drive down through Utah County once in a while and think, my word. I mean, I'm anxious to have our roads be decent, and I'm certainly not against good roads, but there's no question that let the door open for money to flow to other sources. How they would have fixed that with a gas tax, whether they could have done it all with a gas tax, I'm not equipped to tell you, but Senator Niederhauser will openly admit that this has happened. It's just what I just described to you. We hope we can reverse that. That's why it's appealing when they came and said, well, the legislators believe that the economic miracle we have is because of our low tax rate. They believe that a 5.2 is going to kill economic development and a 5% isn't going to kill it. Now, I don't tend to agree with that, but that's what they believe. And so they were dead set against any income tax increase. The other issue we got into is that the people for the Medicaid expansion are also going after a sales tax. And so we're going to compete, and they just announced today they've made it to the ballot. So we were going to be competing on the sales tax floor with them. We also have had cities say to us, hey, that's our source of revenue. What are you doing messing with our source of revenue? So as the proposal came from the senator and from a representative in our meetings, the gas tax, we know we need to help fix that, restructure that. And I think without me being here, Jonathan must have talked about it. And we're willing to try and do that. It's going to be a little hard to explain. And one of the things we're finding is that people say, well, can you trust that to happen? Is known unknowns. We believe we can trust the people we're dealing with. The governor, absolutely, and the legislative leadership, if they remain in power, we think we can trust them.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, please do.
One of the best things about my job, probably the reason I keep coming back, it's a stressful job, by the way. I'm 28. I don't know, my hair is, so it's a stressful job. But the reason that I come back is because I get to see cool things like what I saw with this compromise, where they're actually making a difference. I mean, it's the reason that you all are here, right? You come back and you're not getting rich doing this, but you feel like you're making a difference, right? Same thing. And Representative Brad Wilson, Senator Adams, they expended a lot of energy and political capital on this. And I think, if they wind up being the president and the Speaker of the House, they will most definitely be on board, and they'll keep their word. So Board Member Lear said, maybe 50-50. I don't think it's 50-50. I don't know what it is. I haven't handicapped it, but I don't think it's 50-50. I think it's probably better than 50-50 chance that it happens. It's just there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee, right? So you got to be careful about it. But yeah, these folks, they put a lot of effort into it. Representative Schultz, Representative Last, everybody was pushing hard at the end, and especially in the House caucus, it was not easy to get to this outcome. So I think you can count on those folks, as Mr. Karras says, at least the leadership. If they're still in leadership, they're going to keep moving in this direction.
The key thing to me is the commitment they made to continue to fund. The pressure up there, every time they get a little more money, is to lower the taxes. And I tend to believe, whether it's, I can't take responsibility for all of it, but I think the pressure we built stopped a lot of that discussion and helped get this done. You can decide whether that was successful on our part or not, but the pressure now is on them over this 5 years, and you've seen their schedule that they've published, to say we're not only going to do that, we're going to continue to fund and increase the funding for education. There's other things we need to do. Local people need to step up. There's, I think, 5 districts that are up at their maximum, and all the rest of them have some capacity. So there's some other things that you need to think through, but we'll have to do it bite-sized and as a journey. But I agree with Jonathan that we've got some pretty reputable people that have committed to this, and I think we can get it done.
I've got a question, but before I get into the question, I want to kind of preface it a little bit. When our schools now is first getting started and building some momentum, on my end, I was looking at this accountability piece on what's my role as a board member, with this new source of revenue, how will the money flow and flow through whom and what. And still today I have a little bit of an unknown, and I guess if I study what's been presented here, maybe all the answers are there, but as it came out of the legislature, I didn't have my answers or my questions answered yet. And so I'm back to the same kind of challenge, and that is our accountability piece, because it seems like with our schools now, they wanted to bypass this board. They wanted to, of trying to push get funding down into the schools or down into where they were picking where they wanted to go. And then it was actually bypassing local boards and pushing it right into individual schools. And I'm sitting there and says, well, where's the accountability piece, and what does that do with us if the funds have to go through our through USBE down to it? I understand where some of this will go, but I'm wondering if there's any I guess I call it unknowns through the tax side, or whatever, however this settles out, of what's our role, and what's the local board's role, and what's the school's role, because those were all the questions that we're having with our schools now, and now we're having this roll out. So I still have some of those unknowns. If someone can speak to those, I would appreciate it.
I can take a stab at it, and Jonathan might want to too. Let me tell you, first of all, that an initiative is a political document. People like us go out and say, what will the people vote for? And we poll, and we focus group, and we poll, and try and figure out what we can get passed. And so, well, I would change that, or I would fix that, or it was all about how to try and get something passed. And frankly, the public will vote more likely if it goes to their local school and does bypass all of what they see as this big black hole that's above them. Now, that isn't a commentary from me. That's just simply what we found. We did have the local districts that have a responsibility in our proposal to have a structure that they had to follow. And if you remember, if the local district put the structure together so we weren't buying cheerleader uniforms or whatever people wanted to, if there isn't performance improvement over 2 years, then the local school loses the ability to be able to determine their own fate, and it goes back to the district. So the district would take control of the money. We originally thought we'd penalize them, but it didn't make any sense. If you're not meeting your performance, why would you take the money away from them? So we said, well, all right, let's go back, because the district may have a school that's doing a really good job of it in one place, and one of them that's not doing so well, so their perspective can be there. That all now has to be worked through for this legislation to be implemented. And so what I'm telling you is that the legislators, and this is an editorial comment, finally read our proposal and came back and said, wow, we like some of this. We like what you're doing. We like the accountability. We like the idea that's there. But please don't be offended as a group. It was a political document to try and get something passed, and it wasn't a reflection on our feeling about Janet or anyone else here. We have great respect for the state school board.
Well, and just as a follow-up, the accountability piece, I know, I think I can speak for the board, is we take that accountability really seriously. And then as this rolls out and you say, I want these performance things done, I want this done, I want that done, demonstrate this, who has the oversight? Is that going to be the legislature, or is that going to be placed upon us to monitor or come back on reporting? And because there's all these little pieces that come. I'd like to still go back to the color of money when it's earmarked to go to a certain place, and then there's these compliance requirements for that. There's some of it as performance. Is that going to fall on us, or is the dollars even going to come through this organization and go right to the LEA or right to the school? And I still want to try to get that defined for a couple reasons. One is with a lot of new money coming in, and you have to track it and follow it, and that it's not about creating an empire, but there's FTEs attached to that, and then that's more on, and I don't think we're afraid of more, but that's more on our side that we have to have oversight over. And so I'm hoping as this rolls out that the local boards and USBE definitely knows what their role is, and has appropriate funding to provide the oversight that's required for all the different compliance components of whatever rolls out.
Well, at least from my standpoint, we'd welcome your input and would want to have you be comfortable. We can't guarantee we're going to do exactly what you want, I'll be honest with you, but we'd be glad to have your input. And if you want to designate, whether it's the superintendent or assistant superintendent or two or three of you that wants to have a more in-depth discussion as this rolls through the summer, as this working group puts together some flesh on it, I'd invite you to be at the table. I can't guarantee we'll give you what you want, but I think you could have a voice at the table if you want it. So,
Glenn, no, I'm speaking more than anyone else, but that's a good invitation. And it's not that, I just don't want to go back to this. It's not that we are trying to build this empire. It's an effort to be accountable and also reliable as this thing rolls out to if this passes and as all the funding's going through to all of the LEAs. So that's what I'm speaking to.
I can tell you, Chair, when I was a young 34-year-old guy got elected, I had all the answers. Now I'm an older man and I don't have all the answers. I got all the questions down, and we're happy to discuss those questions with you, and the door is open to have your discussion. You guys decide how you want to do that. We trust your superintendent, but if you'd rather do it in another way, you tell us, and let's have you open. At least you know what we're doing. That's I can promise you that. So let's do that.
More questions, comments? I'm not seeing. Do you have anything, Angie? Do you think there's anything we haven't covered?
I think that this accomplished what we were hoping to accomplish, and I'm grateful that these two gentlemen could join us. I'm sure the board is too.
So thank you so much for being here.
When you see Spencer, tell him, what time was Nolan supposed to be there?
Well, if you see Spencer, will you remind him that we had a meeting today?
He's out making money somewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, whippy-doo.